I'm Laura Larkin, and I am the Conservation Officer for Buglife in Cornwall, and I am managing this project along with Scarlett, so the two of us are working on it. If you could shift over to the next slide, Scarlett, please, that would be wondrous. I'm guessing you're going to be able to figure out when I need these swapping as we go forward. So just to introduce you a little bit to Buglife, for those of you who kind of haven't really heard a lot about us before. Buglife is the only organisation in Europe devoted to the conservation of all invertebrates. So we don't just work with pollinators, we work with all invertebrates, things freshwater, spiders, ants, woodlice, slugs, snails, even some marine things, so all invertebrates. There are more than 40,000 invertebrate species in the UK, and many of these are really struggling and are under threat. So invertebrates are vital to maintain a healthy environment and also to provide food, not just for people, but for many other creatures as well. They help to underpin all of life on Earth, and without them, the world's ecosystems really would collapse. They really are incredibly vital and very, very important. So Buglife's aim really is to halt the extinction of invertebrates and to help reverse any declines and achieve sustainable populations going forwards. So before I introduce you to our North Cornwall beelines project, I just wanted to provide you with a bit more background information on pollinating insects. Apologies if these are things that many of you already know, it kind of just really makes good sense to start right at the beginning. So pollinators are really important because they help to maintain a healthy environment, along with many other things. But many plants rely on insects to pollinate their flowers and to complete their reproductive cycle, and the majority of plants can't set seed without being pollinated. It's estimated that around 80% of wildflowers rely on insects for pollination. These plants and flowers, in turn, provide food and shelter for many species of insect, as well as birds and mammals. So it's not just kind of, they're very important wildflowers. Very good for a healthy environment, kind of help keep the diversity up. Pollinators are also vitally important in helping to produce the food that we eat. So fruits and vegetables, quite obviously, are insect pollinated, but even luxury items like chocolate need pollinators to produce them. And it's about 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of the food that we eat depends on pollinating insects. So it's really almost impossible to overemphasize just how important the service that pollinators perform is. They really are very important. So often when people talk about pollinators, I think our minds tend to kind of drift to bees before we really think of anything else. But there are in fact many different types of insects that can pollinate plants. So there's a picture of just a very kind of short snapshot of some of them on the screen here. So butterflies and moths can pollinate. Flies, including hoverflies, beetles, even wasps can also pollinate. There are approximately, in the UK, approximately 6,000 different species that are kind of regular flower visitors. So it's hard to kind of put an exact number on the number of species that pollinate, but yeah, in the region of around 6,000. And of these, there are about 250 species of beetle that pollinate. There are obviously a lot more beetles than that, about 1,500 flies. 208 of those 280 are hoverflies. There are about 1,500 butterflies and moths, and also 270-ish species of bee. So of these, the Hymenoptera, so which is bees, bumblebees, solitary bees, honeybees, are our most significant pollinators, followed by Diptera, which are the flies and hoverflies, and then also Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths. And bees are our most significant pollinators, largely because they're kind of purposefully visiting flowers to take pollen back to their nests to feed their young. Sorry, just having a quick drink. So just looking at bees in a bit more detail, we'll start with the honeybee, as I'm sure all of you are very aware of. Honeybees are social insects, and they live in colonies of up to about 40,000 individuals. There's a queen bee and female workers and males in the colony, and they all work together to provision the nest and help kind of maintain the colony, keep it going. Honeybees tend to get quite a lot of press when pollination is mentioned, and they're kind of often the first species that many people think of when we talk about conserving pollinators. But honeybees tend to be they're kind of farmed. if that makes sense. The hives are managed by people, by beekeepers, and they're kind of kept for honey. So we don't really think on them as kind of wild bees. They're kind of more kind of managed by people. And there is actually kind of growing evidence that honeybees can potentially pose a threat to wild pollinators. And I guess if you can kind of imagine suddenly introducing 40,000 or more additional insects to an area, particularly an area where there aren't many flowers already, that can potentially lead to quite significant competition for the flowers and the floral resources, which can negatively impact on our wild pollinators. This is something that we've kind of got a bit of information about on our website, and at some point Scarlett will put a link in the chat if you're more interested in reading a bit more about this, a link to a blog that one of my colleagues did a little while ago. So moving on to bumblebees. Bumblebees also live in colonies, but unlike honeybees, there's not several thousand of them in the colonies. There's normally between 50 and 400 individuals, depending on the species of bee. Their colonies are much smaller than honeybees, but they're also social insects, and they generally follow a kind of similar principle of working together to maintain the colony. They tend to make their nests kind of just below ground in places such as old small mammal burrows or within kind of tussocky grass. There is one species of bumblebee, the tree bumblebee, which I think only came over to this country in the early 2000s. But they nest above ground, hence the name. And they can often be, if you ever find bumblebees nesting in a like a bird box or anything that you've got up, that would generally speaking be a tree bumblebee. They can also be found in air vents and other such unusual places, but obviously naturally would nest in kind of hollows in trees and places like that. And different species of bumblebee, as in also different species of bee, have all got different length tongues, and so they can all feed from slightly different flowers. I should also mention there are about 25 species of bumblebee in the UK. So the other 245 or so species of bee in the UK are all solitary bees. And these tend to kind of be lesser known. Not so many people are aware of them. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that some of them do look an awful lot like honeybees. Some of them are really, really small, like you can see the one in the top left-hand corner there. Almost looks a little bit like a kind of small fly. So they do, and the one below it is quite wasp-like. So they do tend to get a bit overlooked, but there are, 245-ish species of them in the UK. So unlike bumblebees and honeybees, each female solitary bee provisions her own nest. And although they can nest in large groups or kind of aggregations of the same species, they're not social, and so they don't usually work together. Each female will collect pollen for her own nest and lay eggs in a series of individual cells, and the larvae will then eat the pollen as they grow. Solitary bees can be quite broadly split into two categories. So the ground nest, they're either kind of ground nesting or aerial nesting. Ground nesting bees often nest in places such as loose sandy soil or short grass or kind of patches of bare ground. And if when you've been out walking or gardening, you've ever seen a kind of very, very tiny molehill, obviously not a molehill because they're not that tiny, but anything that resembles a very tiny molehill, these are likely to be the nests of kind of ground nesting solitary bees. So the other kind of group of solitary bees are the aerial nesters, and they tend to nest in places such as old walls, hollow plant stems, deadwood, kind of cliff faces. And they're the bees that will make use of the bee hotels and things that people sometimes put up in their gardens. There are also some bees that have some slightly more unusual nesting habits, which I'm sure Paddy will probably touch on later. One of these is the gold-fringed mason bee, which is the bee on the yellow flower you can see on your slide there. And that bee nests in old discarded snail shells. So they do, definitely have some quite unusual nesting habits. So there's another group of solitary bees I've not touched on who they're called the cuckoo bees or the nomad bees. And they are the kind of wasp-like looking bee that you can see in that picture there. And quite a lot like their bird namesake, the cuckoo, rather than making and provisioning their own nests, they use the nests of other solitary bees to lay their eggs in. Some of them are quite specific and will only lay eggs in the nest of certain species of solitary bee. So you therefore need to have that particular solitary bee present in order to have its cuckoo bee. So some of the cuckoo bees are very, very rare. In fact, there's a project that our colleague Hayley is working on down in South Devon called Life on the Edge, and there's a bee down there that's only known from just this one site in South Devon, the six-banded nomad bee. It is, so they can be really quite rare. Where have I got to? So the other thing to note about bees in general, and also solitary bees, is that generally speaking, depending on their size, they can fly different distances. So generally speaking, the larger the bee is, the further they can fly. And some larger bees can travel up to a few kilometers away from their nesting sites, but some of the smaller bees can only go a few hundred meters. So within that area, they need to be able to find enough flowers, enough food to kind of sustain themselves and keep their populations going. So if there's a bee that only can travel like a few hundred meters and a patch of flowers gets cleared within those areas and they've got nowhere else to go, then unfortunately they just wouldn't be able to survive. So that's why it's really important to kind of make sure there's flowers everywhere, really. So there is, unfortunately, as I'm sure you have all heard of, quite a bit of a problem with our pollinator populations. And I think the figures on this slide kind of speak for themselves, but I will read them to you just in case. So half of our 27 bumblebee species are in decline. 7 bumblebee species have declined by more than 50% in the last 25 years. 2/3 of our moths and 71% of our butterflies are in long-term decline. And across Europe, 38% of bee and hoverfly species are declining, and only 12% are increasing. So there is very clearly an issue with pollinator declines that really needs to be addressed. So we'll have a quick look at the reasons behind these declines. So one of the major ones really is habitat loss. If there's no food and no nesting places for our pollinators, then obviously they've got nowhere to live. And the UK has unfortunately lost over 97% of our flower-rich habitat, our flower-rich grasslands, since the 1940s. This is kind of mostly due to the increase in and also the intensification of agriculture following the Second World War. So technological advances have meant that many farming activities were mechanized and made much more efficient. So seeds much more efficiently cleaned. So rather than there kind of being the odd weed seed in with any of the seeds that were kind of sown in the fields, this process became so efficient that the arable weeds were kind of all but removed and not sown, and therefore didn't kind of crop up anymore. And a lot of our grasslands, a lot of the kind of flower-rich grasslands that used to be used to kind of feed horses and things were ploughed up and used for kind of growing crops as well. But alongside the mechanization, there's also been a huge increase in the use of both pesticides and herbicides. So pesticides and herbicides can have quite far-reaching consequences for invertebrates and indeed other wildlife beyond just the whatever species they're kind of trying to target, the pest species. And neonicotinoid pesticides, insecticides even, for example, have been shown to have harmful effects on all kinds of wildlife, from bumblebees and solitary bees to aquatic invertebrates and even some birds. So yeah, definitely not a hugely positive thing. And also changes in agriculture and increasing urbanization have led the few remaining high quality wildlife sites to really exist in like isolated patches. They've kind of become islands of tiny bits of flower-rich habitat amongst all this kind of just green farmland with not necessarily many floral resources in it. So they've kind of become very fragmented, and it's impossible for many species to kind of travel between them. But it's not just in our countryside that things have kind of changed. Even changes in urban areas have kind of increased the declines, and people's obsession for kind of neat and tidiness has historically, although I think this is gradually starting to change, thankfully, led to quite a lot of public open spaces. The idea that they should just be kept as short mown grass all year round. They need to be tidy, they need to be neat. And as I said, kind of gradually this does seem to be changing, and quite a lot of local authorities now are leaving longer areas. They've got meadows in some areas, and not all of the kind of grass is cut as short as it was. And this it really is a very positive thing, and I'm kind of hopeful that it carries on. we've also kind of found that not so many people over the last kind of few decades are so keen on gardening, maybe as they used to be. And with the kind of the increase in the number of cars, there's been quite a lot of an increase in kind of people paving over their gardens to make room for cars, and even worse than that, using artificial grass, which doesn't even have cracks or anything in between it and just completely smothers the soil underneath, and obviously also introduces lots of tiny bits of plastic into the environment, which is not ideal. But despite all the doom and gloom, all is not lost, and we can change this, and we will change this, and we really would very much like all of you to join us in changing this and joining a little revolution. And I think my next slide is a very short video that will just tell you a little bit about our Beelines initiative. I think unfortunately the sound isn't working, but hopefully you can read the subtitles.
I can hear it perfectly.
So apologies for the loss of the sound on that. The video is up on our website, and I'm sure we can put a link to that in the chat as well if you would like to watch it at a later date. I think it was sent out with your original email too, so hopefully you've had the opportunity to watch that with the sound on. But hopefully from that video you'll have kind of got the idea that Beelines essentially is a huge connected network that reach into every corner of the UK and cover every single county. So this has been a kind of very large project for Buglife that has been many, many years in the making. And the final UK-wide map was launched last spring. So we're very pleased with our full UK Beelines map. They're essentially 3 kilometre wide corridors that link up our best remaining wildflower-rich habitat. To help our pollinators, we need to focus on reconnecting these remaining areas. They're often now really small, quite fragmented, and very difficult or impossible for our pollinators and really all wildlife to travel between. So by focusing our effort and creating more flower-rich areas in as many gaps along the beelines as we can all do our bit. This doesn't mean to say that if you don't live or work on a beeline that you can't contribute to pollinator conservation. Everything that anyone can do is wondrous, and we're very pleased with it. These are just really kind of there to help focus our work. So to map these beelines, we sourced as much data as we could to help us map out the best habitats for pollinators. And we started by highlighting the best wildflower-rich habitat across each county. These included habitats such as chalk grassland, lowland meadows, heathlands, and sand dunes. We then used computer models to model and to determine the kind of the easiest pathway through which these areas could be linked. And after doing that and kind of suggesting a series of links for each county, every county then had its own in-person workshop where local experts and stakeholders could help to decide the best route to take. And that is where beelines came from. I think really the most important thing to note about beelines is that anybody can contribute to these and be a part of a beeline. And any habitat creation at all to help pollinators, no matter how small, can make a really big difference. So whether it's a meadow on a farmland, an area of a school playing field, a road verge, something in your garden, or even just some wildflower seeds planted into a window box or a planter, everyone really can do their bit, and nothing at all is too small. It's really a joint effort. We want everybody possible to take part, and we really would like your help. So that kind of brings us on quite nicely, I think, to our North Cornwall beelines project. I'll show you a bit of a zoomed in map of Cornwall beelines in a minute. But this is the project that we're working on at the moment. It's been very kindly funded by the Green Recovery Challenge Fund. It started last autumn and it's running through until spring 2023. So the project is working with local landowners and communities to help threatened bee species by creating or enhancing 20 hectares of flower-rich habitat along the North Cornwall coast. So the work that we do will be targeted to help we're going to obviously help all pollinators, but we're kind of specifically targeting some of these kind of more rare or threatened bees that Paddy's going to tell you a bit about in a minute. So species such as the buff-banded mining bee, the large scabious bee, and the brown-banded carder bee. And we're essentially looking to plant and sow more food plants for these threatened bees where they need them the most. So this is a map of the Cornwall Beelines network. So you can see it loops the whole way around the coast, and then there's a kind of bit of a line down the spine of Cornwall, and then a few that kind of link the north and the south coast too. So we're doing quite well for beelines down here. And you can see from the map there the three kind of areas with the little flowers over them are areas where we're kind of focusing our work in this project. We're working right along the beeline in North Cornwall from Bude to Penzance. And yeah, so the kind of our focus areas are really around kind of Perranporth and Hubert, around kind of Trevose, Padstow, Polzeath and Rock, and also around Hale and the Towns. Now, these areas have been kind of specifically chosen because they've got quite good areas of existing high quality habitat and are home to some of Cornwall's most threatened bees. So these are places such as the Towns, Penhale Dunes, Kelsey Head, and then Trevose Head, and also the sand dunes around Rock. So yeah, there's some really lovely high quality habitat there. So what are we doing in the project? We are targeting our work in areas where these bees whether we know they are or whether they might be. And we're adding more wildflowers, particularly more food plants for each of the key bee species, many of the species which Paddy will tell you more about later. So in doing this, we are helping to encourage small populations of these bees to spread a bit further through the countryside, and hopefully making their populations just a bit more robust and a bit more resilient to any changes that might happen. We are also raising awareness of bees and what they need to survive, to hopefully inspire everybody to help protect these magnificent creatures that we all share Cornwall with. So our work is kind of broadly split into two areas. There's our on-the-ground habitat work and also kind of work in the local community, but there is a very large amount of crossover between the two. So at the moment, we have got habitat work planned in on 13 sites across along the North Coast with the National Trust, with Cornwall Wildlife Trust, Cornwall Council, some of the local councils, and also some private landowners, including some of the larger holiday parks. And we will be enhancing existing grassland using local provenance seed and plug plants. So essentially, we're harvesting the seed that we sow in each of these sites from very nearby in Cornwall. We're going to be working with some local botanists to survey each of our project sites to establish what wildflower species are already present, and then see what enhancements might be most appropriate and what species it would be best to kind of add to them. So many of our threatened bee species rely on flowers that flower a bit later in the summer. So they feed off plants such as knapweed, field scabious, betony, some of the vetches, and quite a lot of the kind of yellow flowering hawkbits and hawkweeds, the daisy family. And quite often quite a lot of these flowers are cut down before they've been able to kind of finish flowering and set seed. So if they're kind of not around for long enough, they might not necessarily be able to support these bee populations. We have worked with all of our project landowners to produce a long-term management plan for each site to ensure that all of the work we do through the project will be managed sustainably into the future, hopefully giving each of these areas the best chance it can have of supporting populations of threatened bees and other pollinators going forwards. So the majority of the seed we sow in this project will be collected from the local area. And we are going to be out in late summer and early autumn harvesting areas of wildflowers. And if you do live nearby, you'd be more than welcome to come along and give us a hand. Some of the seed will be collected using machinery. And if we do that, we'll probably harvest kind of multiple wildflower species in one go. But some of the seed we will be collecting by hand. And this very targeted approach kind of means that we can ensure that we've got ample seed from the bees' seed plants to sow into our project sites this autumn and winter. Another thing worth mentioning, I'm sure Paddy will touch on this, I've kind of deliberately avoided mentioning bees too much up until this point, but one of the bees we're working a lot with in this project is the large scabious bee, and it only feeds from field scabious, as I mentioned before, and he takes pollen from field scabious. And we're particularly trying to kind of increase the amount of field scabious along the north coast. It's traditionally a calcareous plant, so it tends to be found on kind of sandier soils. And the soils in Cornwall are quite acidic. So because of that, field scabious is really only found in these few areas around the backs of these sand dune systems. So because there is not much field scabious in Cornwall, we managed to harvest some seed last year. We'll be harvesting some more this year. And we've also been growing it on as plug plants to plant out, just to make the best use of the seed that's available to us. So the other strand of our project is work with local communities in North Cornwall. We'll be out this summer running talks and workshops along the North Coast. We're keen to introduce as many people as we can to our project and the fabulous bees in kind of indoor settings, but we'll definitely very much be venturing outside and running events. Largely to kind of help people improve their identification skills. There'll be some work, we're doing some workshops on wildflower identification and also some on bee and pollinator identification, hopefully getting out in the field with some of you who are here today at some point and learning a bit more about bees and other pollinators. Hopefully be able to see some of the kind of rarer species that Paddy will talk about in a bit as well. Alongside these bee and wildflower workshops, we're also going to be running some sessions introducing flower insect timed counts, which are a part of the pollinator monitoring scheme. These are basically a fantastic way to help gather long-term information on pollinator abundance, pollinator numbers. And it's kind of, I'm sure many of you will have come across like the big butterfly count, big garden bird watch, and bumblebee, the bee walks that the Bumblebee Conservation Trust do. And this is kind of a similar scheme, but for all pollinators. So essentially, gathering all the information over time will give us a much clearer idea of pollinator abundance. And essentially, all you have to do is watch a patch of flowers for 10 minutes and record how many different types of insects you see. I think Scarlett can probably post a link in a bit in the chat, kind of linking to the fit count, as they're known for short, the website, in case any of you are interested in learning a bit more about them. But yeah, we're very keen to kind of teach people how to do them and in turn kind of learn a little bit more about pollinator identification, how to split some of the different groups apart. So yeah, that would be good. Looking forward to those. So hopefully if any of you come along to any botanical workshops, you could make use of any newfound botanical skills. We'll be running some seed harvesting events a bit later in the summer, where anyone who's interested can come along, help us collect some field scabious seed and hopefully some seed for some other species as well. And then we'll also be running events in the kind of autumn and winter time, sowing these seeds into some of our project sites and actually creating the meadows themselves. We've got a lot of plug plants to plant as well, so any help with that would be greatly appreciated. We'll also later in the year be running some workshops, letting people know how they can help pollinators on their own land. So we'll be running a variety of workshops for businesses, farmers, local communities, hopefully providing anyone who is perhaps kind of interested but not quite sure of how to start some of the kind of best and simplest ways that they can help pollinators. If you're interested in coming along to anything I've just mentioned, I will give you some information in a minute about how you can join our mailing list. And we're also actually able to offer advice to landowners in our focus areas. So if either you know of anyone who might be interested in having some kind of advice about how they can help pollinators, and they kind of live around, I'll mention where they are again in a minute. But if anyone lives in any of our focus areas and wants some specific advice, then please do get in touch. So alongside all of that, we've also created a mini meadow pack for anyone who lives in or near any of our focus areas or along the North Cornwall beeline, to create some flower-rich habitat in their gardens. So this pack contains a kind of mix of annual and perennial plant species. The perennial species are some of the food plants that our target bee species feed from. I think it's a mix of, I'm not going to remember these now. Bird's foot trefoil,
scabious, bird's foot trefoil, common knapweed, red clover as the perennials, and then corn poppy, corn chamomile, and yeah, those are the annuals. I think it's 2 annuals, right?
I think so. Amazing. Thank you, Scarlett. So essentially, the perennials normally take a couple of years before they will flower, but when you've got them flowering, they should last forever and ever and ever, provided they're kind of managed correctly. The annuals will flower in the first year and will provide some colour and some flowers in the first year, but also hopefully reassure you that your seeds are growing and that something is happening. So yeah, if you live in one of our focus areas or along the beeline in North Cornwall and would like some seeds, then either come along to one of our events. We'll always have some with us then. Or if you'd like, you can drop me an email and I can stick them in the post to you. And I'll put my email address on the last slide in this presentation in a minute. We can leave that up for a second if any of you want to note it down. So we are also inspiring the next generation by working with some of our local primary schools. On our website, we have an education pack, which has information and activities teaching primary school age children about how wonderful and diverse bees are, why they're declining, and kind of how they can get involved and how they can help. There's loads of different activities to get involved in it, lots of kind of fun and engaging ways to kind of get them thinking about pollinators. The packs are designed to be completely self-led, so any teacher anywhere can work through them with their class. So if any of you are teachers, or if any of you know of anyone who might be interested in taking a look, then please do pass this on to resource on to them. And again, I think Scarlett can put a link to that pack in the chat, but it's on our North Cornwall Beeline's website. So we're also growing field scabious plants with a handful of local primary schools in our focus areas, just helping to provide a bit more food for the large scabious bee. And yeah, and teaching children a little bit about kind of what plants need in order to grow and survive and thrive. So my final few slides now, I just wanted to very quickly run through a few of the things that some of you could potentially do in your own homes, places of work or anything, just to help really make a difference to pollinators. And I think really I just want to reiterate again that please don't ever think that anything is too small to be worthwhile. There really is no such thing, and every tiny little action can really help make a really big difference. So quite obviously pollinators need flowers, and really the main aim is to provide some flowers at all times of year, but particularly between spring and autumn when pollinators are most active. Don't feel you need to plant just native flowers, because many garden plants are also fantastic for pollinators and can have quite long flowering seasons. The only thing really to be wary of is planting any double varieties or any hybrid varieties. These can sometimes be either sterile, where they don't have any pollen, or really kind of fancy, where they've got those really fancy petals. Sometimes there might be pollen present, but it can be completely inaccessible to insects. Another thing to note, as I mentioned previously, is different bees and other pollinators have got different length tongues, and this can impact on what flowers they're able to access. So bees with longer length tongues can feed on some of the slightly deeper flowers, but those with shorter length tongues prefer the more open ones. So really the key is to plant as many different shapes of flower as possible to hopefully benefit as many different species of pollinator as possible. So moving away from flower beds, you can also help pollinators by leaving your lawn to grow a little bit longer. I'm sure as many of you probably know, it's currently No Mow May, which is an initiative started by Buglife, which fantastically many people have signed up for, which is amazing to see. And essentially it encourages people to leave their lawns uncut for the month of May to help plants such as kind of dandelions and clovers and self-heal and some of the other kind of shorter flowering plants to actually have the chance to flower. It doesn't have to be restricted to May though, and leaving areas of your lawn to grow for either for longer periods or for other periods of the year is also fantastic. I tend to cut around on my dandelions in my lawn. They tend to flower in April, and yeah, I tend to leave patches of dandelions and cut around them. So you can do that as well, rather than you can mow bits of the lawn and just leave the areas that are in flower at that particular time. Or you can kind of just relax your mowing regime a bit rather than cutting it regularly and cutting it short. You could maybe cut it a bit less frequently and cut it on a bit of a higher setting just to allow, yeah, some of the clovers and things to flower. And that will all have great benefits for bees and other pollinators. You can also create a mini meadow by using wildflower seed to turn a part of your lawn or a flower bed or a planter or a plant pot or a window box or a hanging basket or anything into a wildflower area. This is a little mini meadow in the slide there, so you can see the kind of meadows growing, but right next to it the lawn is cut quite short. These areas are generally left uncut from April to September, and then they should be cut, and then all the cuttings kind of cleared and raked off over winter. Essentially over time this will reduce the amount of nutrients in the soil. So wildflowers don't really like nutrients. They would prefer, they kind of grow better in places with less nutrients, whereas grass tends to grow better in places with more nutrients. So yeah, kind of doing that gradually reduces the amount of grass in the area and hopefully allows the wildflowers to flourish. Quite often you might not even need to seed these areas if you just manage an area of your garden in that way and leave it grow long and then cut it and clear it once a year in the kind of autumn time. Then gradually over time flowers should appear on their own. So alongside flowers, pollinators also need somewhere to nest and to seek shelter over winter. So you can help by providing some kind of natural nesting spaces in your kind of on your land, such as kind of bare soil, short grass, patches of dead wood, just leaving parts of your garden untouched. You can also provide artificial nesting places such as bee hotels, like the one in the middle of this picture. You don't necessarily need to buy these from a shop. They can simply be made by drilling holes in logs and providing kind of bamboo canes. Ideally with these, the holes would be between about 2 millimeters and 10 millimeters. They seem to kind of, yeah, most pollinator species that we use them will make use of those. Some of the holes in the bee hotels that you can buy are a bit too big and useful for spiders and other things, but not so much for the bees. I think one of the major problems we see with people not getting anything using these is that they really need to be placed in a kind of warm and sheltered position, such as like a south-facing wall. And they kind of like to go about chest height, really, or maybe slightly higher. So another thing, helping insects finding places to kind of shelter over winter is also really important. So many species of bee will kind of remain in their nesting sites until spring, but for other invertebrates, it's quite important just not really to be too tidy and just kind of, yeah, don't kind of clear everything up the minute it kind of falls down. So if you can leave some dead leaves where they are, or rake them into a leaf pile in the corner of your garden rather than kind of clearing them away, that would be fantastic. And leaving kind of dead stems on plants until the weather warms up in the spring is also really beneficial. I mean, some seed heads are really quite beautiful in their own right and kind of make the garden just look a bit more interesting over winter, but yeah, can also act as a really good place for some insects to shelter. Yeah, I think that's it for that one. So finally, just a few other things that can be done when working in your garden. So adding water is one of the very best things that you can do to kind of improve biodiversity in an area. I mean, pretty much everything needs to drink. It doesn't need to be a large or a fancy pond, and even just adding a bucket of water or like a washing up bowl and burying that in the garden will hugely help. It really should go without saying, but not using pesticides or herbicides in your garden will also help pollinator populations, and indeed also other wildlife and people. And even organic insecticides are designed to kill, and so they're really not much better than the chemical ones. And finally, many people already have, but ensuring that you're using a peat-free compost wherever you do buy any compost. This will help to prevent the destruction of peat bogs, which are not only a fantastic wildlife habitat, but also a great carbon sink. So they obviously absorb and store huge amounts of carbon dioxide. So as I've already mentioned, it will be great if you would like to get involved in anything of our project, to keep up to date with what's going on in North Cornwall beelines and all of our events and activities. You can sign up to our mailing list on our project webpage. The link to the project webpage was in your event invitation, but it will be posted in the chat as well. You can join us either to learn more about how to identify plants or pollinators, or how to help collect also seed and enhance these habitats. And you can sow your own mini meadows in your garden. And again, if you would like any free wildflower seeds and you live in one of our focus areas, then please do drop me an email and we can post them out to you. My email will be on the screen in just a second. But the focus areas, just to remind you, are kind of around Padstow, Rock and Polzeth, around Cubitt, Perranporth, and also Hale and the Towns. And very finally, if you know of any primary school teachers who might be interested in working through our education pack, then please do share it with them. And we're always happy to answer any questions. So very finally, if you do create your own meadow, or if you have ever done, or indeed do ever do anything at all to help pollinators in your garden, in your educational setting, in a workplace, or on your own land in any way at all, then we really would love to hear about it. So please do share some pictures with us and add it to our beelines map. This can be done on the beeline section of our website, and is really a very simple case of adding a pin to a map and just completing a few simple questions on a form. It really, really helps us to see what fantastic projects people get up to, and will also hopefully help you to feel a small part of something much bigger, and know that we're all working together to help pollinators and other wildlife be able to thrive in our landscapes once more. So yeah, thank you so much for listening to me. I'm sorry I have overrun slightly. I do have a tendency to waffle. But my email address is there on the screen at the moment. So if you do want to drop me an email about anything at all, then yeah, please do. And
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. I could also, would you be happy for me to pop it in the chat?
Yes, please do. Yeah.
People can see that there. Wonderful. So if I stop sharing, I can see you all again. Hi. So I'll pop those links in the chat that you've mentioned. And in the meantime, if Paddy, if you were happy to start sharing, yeah?
Okay. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Hi, I'm Paddy. You won't see me for a minute. You'll just see some pictures. Oh, oh, I've just accidentally closed it. Screen 2. Here we are. Sorry, I think I pressed the wrong button here.
That's okay. Once you got it back up.
Yeah.
I'm just popping in these links to chat for everyone, so they can find all those things you mentioned, and they can also find this presentation again. So any of the slides.
So is there a picture in the screen there now? Because I think I turned everything off and did it wrong there.
If you just click share screen at the bottom.
It's gone off.
It should just be on the bottom bar with the little green arrow pointing up.
Yeah, it's disappeared.
Oh,
okay. Tried to find the Zoom. Oh, here you are. The Zoom thing is on there. Why has it done that then? Let's start.
The joys of technology.
I can always share for you if it's really. Oh, there we go.
Sorry.
No, it's fine. We can see your cat.
Yeah, that's Muffin.
Oh.
Is that coming up there now?
That's
yeah,
it.
that's perfect. We can see
Great.
lovely waves of kidney veg.
Yeah, sorry about that. I pressed the wrong button as usual. Hi, I'm Paddy, and I'm an ecologist. I specialise in bees and wasps, but I do a lot of other insects. I've been quite involved in butterflies, like the small purple-bordered fritillary in Cornwall, for quite a number of years. I've got my own projects specifically on the long-horned mining bee, but then I also work at the monkey sanctuary, and I've had quite a lot of experience doing the wildlife gardens there, and I'm quite enthusiastic and keen meadow creator as well, and plant grower. But on this project, I'm partnering with Buglife on the North Cornwall Bees project. And this talk was really a bit of an introduction to some of the specialist scarce bees in Cornwall, running through some of them and a bit about their ecology, and some of them how to identify them. Sorry if I go backwards and forwards a bit into the Latin and common names. When I first started doing bees, there was just a couple of photocopied, very difficult to use keys that all had Latin terms and Latin names. More recently, since Steve Falk's books come out, and since the advent of the internet and more information out there, it's become a lot more easy to identify a lot of these bees. But that has also meant that they've all got different common names and come more widely into use. So unfortunately, I have to swap a bit in between them. So just let me know if that starts getting a bit confusing. So you can see a bit of Cornish cliff here. We can see here a dot map of the diversity of bees in Cornwall. You can see the deeper dots here show sites with 90 plus species. So you can see the coast has got some very diverse sites. There's something like 180 species of bee in Cornwall. So it's quite a diverse county. It's up there among some of the highest counties in the UK. In the southeast, they've got some slightly better lists. Like I think Surrey's more like 250 or so. But 180, it's a good number, and it's probably going up. Typical, eh? Shows what a busy person I am. Sorry. And where was I? 180 species, but actually the scope to find more species, like Cornwall, a couple of new species got recorded last year, and the total number is probably more like 185 species. This is one of the gentlemen who you could say was the pioneer of Cornish bee recording, Malcolm Spooner. He was the first person to systematically study bees in the West Country. Oh, not the first, but I'd say he was one of the most widely recorded bee recorders in the West Country. He covered Devon, Cornwall, Somerset and Dorset. He's actually got a wasp that's named after him, and his field notebooks and his diaries and his reports are still amazing sources of information to show us what the fauna was like 50 years ago. He was actually a code breaker at one of the sister places to Bletchley Park during the war. He had quite an interesting life. He apparently broke some of the codes on the Eastern Front for some of the German tank movements. He also worked at the Plymouth Marine Biological Association and produced quite a number of papers on totally unrelated things, algae and seaweeds. But at his time, he was an immense source of knowledge, and apparently he was pretty keen and friendly to help other bee and wasp recorders at the time. He actually lived up at Yatherton in Devon. And as I say, his notebooks and diaries, which are actually in the Natural History Museum in London, are a real, still kind of an incredible source of information on the ecology of some of these rare species. So you can see a lovely bit of grassland. Cornwall has got a rich range of habitats. We saw a bit about the diversity on the map, that they're largely coastal, the most diverse sites, although the moorlands, Bodmin Moor, mid-Cornwall moors, the lizard heaths also have quite a few specialist species, and they're also pretty important. But on the coasts, it's these rarer habitats of these mosaics of Cornish dunes and late flowering maritime grasslands that are really important for these rare species and support a rich range of fauna. And here we can see a kind of nice late flowering meadow full of tufted vetch and legumes. Landscape connectivity is really important. So some of the rare bumblebees, they estimate, need a minimum of 10 kilometres of habitat. And so if you're a rare specialised bee needing 10 kilometres of habitat, that often means 10 kilometres of the highest quality grassland. So in the modern day landscape, this is really difficult to find. And so the coast, from pretty much from the Heartland Point all the way around the Lizard, all the way around North Coast to the Lizard, stopping the other side of the Lizard, forms an almost contiguous mosaic of dunes, heaths and unimproved grasslands as a strip, although narrow one. So the important thing about beelines really is buffering and strengthening that existing high quality habitat, which inland has disappeared quite dramatically. So if you go on to some of the bee species, this is the shrill carder bee, Bombus silvarum. This used to have quite a few records in Cornwall. It's probably Britain's most threatened bee, really. The only strong populations it have is on southwest Wales, Somerset levels, and in the Thames Basin. Even Salisbury Plain, that's a massive stretch of flower-rich grassland, this bee has recently probably disappeared from. And the Somerset levels, the population is quite weak there. So it's quite scary what's happened to a bee like this. If you read the old accounts, it was quite a widespread, not common, but people often encountered it in the countryside. And this is a bee that's associated with rich hay meadows and these late flowering grassland habitats. I'll go to the next one. So you can see field of devil's bit scabious here. It's these later richer habitats with these which have become the most threatened through agricultural intensification. Here we can see a bit of the North Cornwall coast near Jacobstow, and that's Greenham Moor, and this is a section of the Culm grassland. The Culm grassland are particularly rich and interesting habitats covering quite a bit of North Cornwall inland, but these are one of the habitats, the inland habitats, that have had quite devastating losses. If you look at this map, you can see Greenham Moor, the Cornwall Wildlife Trust Reserve, covers an area here, and big conifer plantation in the middle, and this little patch here that marked with the tussocky grassland sort of symbol. Whereas if you go to the map of the 1960s, well, it's 1930s to 1960s, you can see great big swathes of the map are covered with this tussock grassland system, all of these areas and all of these areas. So these would probably have been large areas of flower-rich culm grassland. And you can see this section has got planted up with a conifer plantation. And it's really these inland habitats that have probably had the most dramatic change in the post-war period. Laura mentions pesticides, but also fertiliser has had a great deal of impact. So between 1961 and 1990, fertiliser use was up by 300%. High fertiliser use enabled farmers to cut silage more frequently, work the land more, also cut it more, which meant there was no room for the flowers to survive, and these results in nutrient-rich grassland dominated by species such as perennial ryegrass. So a lot of North Devon, when you go there, and North Cornwall, you'll see acres and acres of green, well, I would call deserts of perennial ryegrass, where they cut them for silage 3 or 4 times a year. The other change to inland habitats has been sheep grazing on places like Bombin Moor. So sheep went up by 50% between 1976 and 1997. Thankfully, on the moors, more of these areas are under stewardship arrangements and conservation grazing, and the picture is changing up there. But I'll go back to some of these species rather than being able to explain the whole picture of landscape change in Cornwall. So a while ago, we were talking about the culm grassland, and I had a picture of Devil's Bit scabious and talked about late flowering grassland. The scabious bees in particular are probably the most declined group of bees, really. There was actually 4 different bees in Cornwall that were specialised on both field and Devil's Bit scabious, and now there's only one. This is one of the bees that's probably extinct in Cornwall, Andrena marginata, the small scabious bee. It's actually quite a distinctive, attractive looking bee. It's actually quite small with a red abdomen, but it's almost certainly extinct in Cornwall. The other bee that is extinct is Bombus sorensis, the broken banded bee. That was formerly found on these culm grasslands on late flowering habitats, particularly rich in Devil's Bit scabious. And a knock-on effect to these declines has been the cuckoos. Laura mentioned how rare cuckoo bees are often rarer than their hosts. Well, the small scabious bee also had a cuckoo bee, and Nomada argentada, sorry, I can't get the name right, or you can basically call it the scabious cuckoo, was also found in Cornwall, but that is probably extinct. And then the last one, which we've already skirted round, the large scabious bee, or Andrena hatiofana, had a nomad bee associated with it, Nomada armata, which you could call the large scabious bee nomad, which was also found in Cornwall. Sorry, I'm getting a bit tongue-tied by the names. So you've got 4 scabious bees that were found, and now there's one. We'll go back in a minute to the large scabious bee and what this project is hoping to do, and hopefully we can have a bit of a brighter future rather than just a sort of depressing story of decline. So one of the other scarce bees that is often found on related habitats, maritime grasslands on the coast, and particularly likes kidney vetch, which we saw on the first picture, is the brown-banded carder bee, Bombus humilis. It's quite an attractive gingery bee, and the bee you might notice in your gardens at the moment, the bumblebee, is the common carder bee, and it looks quite similar to this, but it hasn't got, the common carder bee's got a very black abdomen, lots of black hairs here, whereas the brown-banded carder is pretty much orange cornflake colour all over. Quite attractive bee when you see it. And the best places to look are on headlands on the North Cornish coast on kidney vetch. Although later on, when the workers come out, you can look on dune habitats and on rich meadows and look for the workers, which quite like other legumes actually, clover, but also quite like Viper's buglass on the dunes. So the other bee that looks very similar to the brown-banded carder bee is the moss carder bee. Now this probably requires an expert workshop to separate the two, but again it's quite an attractive sort of orange all over bee. This bee often has a bit more of a lemon yellow tinge to the back of it. It occurs in the same habitat, but if anything, it's rarer than the brown-banded carder bee. So if we see a map for here, we see a similar picture that becoming a bit of repeated, that it's declined inland and its strongest populations are on these coastal areas of the north coast around similar to where the project is happening, and also on the Lizard and on the north Land's End coast. This bee has actually become pretty rare in Cornwall. It's not exactly sure why this bee has become rarer than the brown-banded carder bee, as it has fairly similar ecological requirements, liking the most high-quality flower-rich grasslands. Both of these two bumblebees they can be called doorstep foragers, which means they forage close to their nest, which also has the knock-on effect that they need a lot of different resources from May to the end of their season, August, September, throughout a small area. So diverse, rich, flower-rich grassland. But the moss carder bee likes damper sites and cooler sites. It does better in Scotland and the north. So most likely it's climate change is having a bit of an impact, and switching these paired species, that Bombus humilis, the brown-banded carder, has a better chance rather than the moss carder bee in a warming climate, but it's not exactly proven yet. So the bee, Laura has already talked about it a bit, the large scabious bee. This is another specialised bee, but even more specialised. In Cornwall, it only uses one type of plant, the field scabious. So specialism, usually for bees, means they're specialised on collecting one type of pollen. That can often mean for their nectar resources, they can be foraging on quite a few different plants. And trying not to segue onto the detailed account of all that, is there is quite a bit of a difference between pollen and nectar, that largely the specialised bees specialise on one type of pollen. Nectar is pretty much sugar syrup or a kind of Coca-Cola drink that they use to power their flight and to run around and do busy activities. Whereas pollen is the stuff they shove into a hole in the ground that feeds the workers and the offspring. And that has to be more nutrient rich, and it varies more from plant to plant. And many of these bees have different adaptations to either harvest a certain type of pollen or digest it. So, and some even have gut faunas of bacteria that help them specifically to digest a specific plant that another bee can't. So this bee in Cornwall, as I say, is just on large scabious. This is a male. You can see the male's a bit more distinctive. It's got a white face. The large scabious bee is quite big for an andrena, which is a group of bees that are all ground nesting, and they all have a solitary life cycle. And for that group of bees, one that size, that's blackish with a few red hairs at the back, and it's on scabious, is not a too bad one to record. Some of the other little tiny black bees you see in the field are a bit of a nightmare, but I'm sure you can post photos to Laura if you do see a big blackish bee on field scabious. We'd be really interested in knowing what site that was at.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is a picture of a typical site with a typical occupant of the site, a golfer here. So this bee has done really well on golf courses. Scabious is generally a dune edge species that occurs on where there is a bit of shell sand on the edge of more fertile farmland. But while a lot of the central dunes are very nutrient poor and have shorter species, the edges have a bit more fertility and they can support taller grassland and can support field scabious. So the bee tends to have a limited niche in the county. So it occurs around the edges of these big dune systems. There's about 6 areas, and there's good evidence the bee has declined and is quite vulnerable. Some of these colonies are pretty small. So we've got some big dune systems here at the Gwythian Towns, the Penhale Towns, and you can see these black dots are where the colonies are found. There's also another very small site on rock, Constantine, around Constantine dunes here, and around rock here. And it's some of these sites that are quite vulnerable. Like this site here is the church, St. Uni near Lelant. And although you can quite easily see 10 or so large scabious bees there, this colony is pretty isolated, and it really emphasises the need for more conservation efforts through this project to buffer the habitats around for this bee, and which is quite a simple intervention. It's just creating lots of flowers and lots of food for this bee, which appears to be the main limiting factor for its populations. So a bit more of a detailed map here. You can see the foraging, the range, this buffer here is about 900 meters, and that shows about the extent of habitat they're going out from their nest sites to forage on. And being a bit more optimistic again, last year the project found a number of new records of this bee on this area here around Godrevi. This was a sort of new colony. It was pretty exciting, and it was actually using some of the plants I'd planted, quite a small amount, about 50 scabious plants I'd planted in an area, and it had found them from an adjacent area of habitat which had quite a bit of scabious that none of us had been in before. So it's a bit of an optimistic picture that something can be done and something needs to be done, and that sort of thing. So this is a dune site. So bare ground is really important. I just scrolled through my thing, I've lost my thing. So the dune sites, such as Gwythian and Penhall, they're very important for a range of species. These solitary nesting, ground nesting bees need bare, friable soil that has the right microclimate. And it's these sites that you can get a very rich assemblation, not just of bees, but also solitary wasps and other ground nesting invertebrates. This is a site here of one of the bees, the pantaloon bee. You can see a bit of bare track here that people have been trampling on. If you go down here in summer, it'd be full of people in shorts and flip-flops bumming up and down to the beach, and maybe one entomologist with a net staring at the dirt. So bare ground, very important resource which dunes excel at and sandy sites excel at, but also sandy sites are rich in flowers. So it's having these two habitats, both nest habitats, and a rich range of unimproved with light farming around habitats with a lot of flowers for them to forage on. So this is a little shot of one of the pantaloon bees in a nest poking its head out. They often sort of hang out at the entrance there waiting for a sunny day, which I do every day. So the pantaloon bee, you could call it the 1970s trousers bee. It's got big woolly orange trousers. Looks like could be in a funk band in the 1970s. What are those trousers for? Well, they're all the better for absorbing pollen, but this bee is an aster specialist, so it goes for any of the plants in the daisy family, but one of its favourites does appear to be knapweed, ragwort. And some of the ragwort bees have got a bit of an interesting thing going on, in that we all know ragwort is a bit toxic and poisonous, but these bees have a specific gut fauna and digestive system that allows them to digest the ragwort pollen better than other bees. That means they can utilize a resource that other bees won't necessarily use. So they then become specialists on one of these plants. And there's a bit of trade-off between being a specialist and a generalist, in that generalists can exploit all sorts of range of habitats, and if you trim all of their flowers, they can move somewhere else. But a specialist has a bit of a shopping cart syndrome. So there's an element that if I went into Lidl to find something and it was all the same row in the same place, I can throw it all on my shopping trolley very quickly and very efficiently. And there's an element of that in specialism, can make you more efficient at exploiting one resource, but also potentially you could be specialist like this bee and exploit a resource that other bees find toxic or unpleasant or are unable to exploit the pollen from. So it's all about finding niches in any ecosystem, and the more niches there are, the more diverse the bee faunas. So another sandy ground in June bee is the silvery leafcutter bee. This bee is a leaf cutter. So the leaf cutters, this one is actually ground nesting, but quite a few of them are aerial nesting. And you might have seen them in your garden if you're very lucky, but they tend to cut a little bit of leaf out, make a kind of cigar-like structure out of rolled up leaves with other circles of leaves bunging the end in, and then fill these structures with both eggs and balls of pollen and nectar, hence the name leafcutter. So this bee is a local bee found on coastal habitats, and it's one of the few leafcutter bees that's got white hairs on the underside. It's quite a small little thing, and on good sites you potentially see hundreds, maybe even thousands occasionally. Like a couple of years ago I was at Low Bar, and the place was just swarming with these little tiny leafcutters going into all the ground here. One of the other leafcutters is this coastal leafcutter bee. It's a bit bigger. It's got red on the underside. It's a bit more difficult to identify. And we mentioned the bees that nested in, Laura mentioned the bees that nested in snail shells. Well, this is quite an attractive orangey bee that is found on the coastal habitats in Cornwall, particularly the dunes again, but it does occur on other cliffs. It really likes bird's foot trefoil, and is to a certain extent a legume specialist. This is called the gold-fringed mason bee, but it uses snail shells as nest sites. Some of them actually rotate. I've got quite complex life histories that they rotate the entrance of the snail shell in the sun, so the entrance is optimized to be in the warmest place. But I'm not an expert on this. There is more information of other people on this bee. But there's quite a range of different nest habitats these bees need that in more complex environments like the coast tend to support. So one of the very rare bees in Cornwall, which is more of a Cornwall specialist, is the buff-banded mining bee. This is another solitary ground nesting bee in that Andrena family, the same family that the large scabious bee is. It's a bit more difficult to identify. It's quite advanced. It's a bit of a brownie sort of bee. It's not easy to record for everyone. But you can see from the distribution map how rare it is. Really, possibly Cornwall has the strongest populations of this bee in the UK. Other strong populations are on the Salisbury Plain here as well. And there are a couple of older records in other places, although it could crop up in other places. So it's a Cornwall Atlantic coastal specialist. I did quite a bit of work trying to work out exactly why it was specialised in Cornwall and what its ecology was a couple of years ago, because there's been very few accounts or information out there as to what it feeds on and why it's rare. This is a picture of the female, and what I found out was it was mostly a knapweed specialist. I did pollen samples. I collected individual bees, put them in a little tube, waited for a minute. They get a bit hot and then would drop all the pollen off their legs into the bottom of the tube. Then I sent them off to a comrade who helps identify the plants and the pollen for me to try and work out what their foraging preferences were. And what I found out were they started out on all the sites in Cornwall pretty much as collecting pollen from bramble. And then in the later part of their flight period, they moved on to collecting pollen from knapweed, black knapweed, the flower that was on the other picture, the sort of reddish thistly flower that is quite common in a range of habitats. So you'd think, why is this bee so rare? It likes bramble, a common plant, knapweed, a common plant relatively, but it's probably down to the abundance of knapweed and it needing a really serious amount of knapweed close to nests in good quantities, but also quite a lot of these patches. So individual colonies can have some crossbreeding and some population structure. So it needs the best knapweed sites that are kind of like closest together with the most flowers. So that pretty much leads you to the North Cornwall coast along the coastal strip. It's probably a bit of a barometer of some of the other bees that occurs on the higher quality sites, where some of the other related species that I'll show you pictures in a minute probably can cope with having a few less flowers. I don't know if that explains it very well or not. Such as this bee, the black-ended mining bee. Andrena similis, the buff-banded mining bee, is a red data book bee. This bee is a nationally scarce bee. It occurs on similar sites. Does have pretty strong populations in Cornwall again, but again is quite strongly associated with knapweed, but does occur on other late asters, such as thistles, and it does sometimes collect plants off other flowers. So unlike the previous bee, it's sort of got a bit more flexibility, which helps it do better on different sites. And then this bee, which is another bee, another Andrena or solitary bee, the grey branded mining bee. A lot of this group of bees have little bands along the side like this, these three. And this is another specialist of knapweed, of asters, but it does occur on knapweed, but often you find it on fleabane. So on a good site in North Cornwall, you can find all of these three bees. This probably you can't say is rare, but it is localized and found on nicer sort of grassland areas. We were saying about rarer nomads or cuckoo bees are often much rarer than their hosts. Well, a cat's ear nomad bee is a bee that is a cuckoo of another bee. I should remember its common name, but I can't. But it's the cat's ear mining bee. And you can see how rare it is. The Andrena fullivago, or the cat's ear bee that's its host, is actually Andrena humilis, sorry, the cat's ear nomad bee, cat's ear Andrena, is found all over the North Cornwall coast and the South Coast and quite a bit inland. But you can see this nomad is only found on maximum about 7 or 8 sites in Cornwall from the distribution maps. So it emphasises the fact that some of these nomad bees are very scarce and require very strong populations of these host species. There's another nomad bee that's found on another yellow composite or yellow daisy plant, Nomada facilis, which hasn't even got a common name. It's a recently discovered species to England that might be found in Cornwall. And that again is a pretty scarce species, but could crop up. And meadows with lots of cat's ears and autumn hawkbit can be quite rich and productive places for looking for solitary bees. Going off to completely different habitats, this bee, Perkins mining bee, Andrena rosea, another mining bee, a ground nesting bee, but with a fairly different ecology. This bee is fairly distinctive. It looks like a honeybee with lots of red on it. But if you see the distribution map, again, you'll see basically it's West Wales and Cornwall. And the amount of dots on the map are very small. This is a red data book with very strong populations, particularly down Land's End. I think more recently, a couple of people in the last couple of years have found it on a few more sites. like I think it's another bee that has turned up on the Salisbury Plain and a couple of places down southeast. But I think still, so far, the best knowledge is that Cornwall and South Wales are the strongest places to see this bee. I should say there is some evidence it has had quite a bit of decline, and I probably worry about some of these sites on Bodmin Moor and round Tintagel Boscastle, because I think I've been seeing smaller numbers than I did do in the past. And the chap Malcolm Spooner I was talking about before had quite a number of records from Bodmin Moor from sites where it's no longer present. It seems to like quite cold, wet habitats. So again, it could be a bee that won't benefit from climate change. This is what it looks like. It's like a small sort of honeybee looking bee, but it's got a lot of red on it. If you get it in a hand lens or under close observation or take a decent photo, it's not fantastically difficult to identify. Here we can see the amount of red extends quite a lot on this section of the body. Unfortunately, you do see individuals that have very narrow little red bands that are quite hard to tell apart. But usually down Land's End, if you go particularly on Angelica in late summer, you should see a few of these quite easily. So this bee occurs in 2 broods. So many of the bees we mentioned before occurred as one generation. So they'd come out in midsummer of an individual hole in the ground, go out, forage madly for 5 weeks, and then go back in. This is the typical ecology of a solitary bee rather than a bumblebee that would last for maybe 2 months or so. But this bee is double brooded. So in spring, there's a generation that comes out that forages on willow and blackthorn over about 5 or 6 week period. It has to bring pollen in and establish a generation. And then the next generation, the youngsters from that generation probably come out and emerge in late summer and forage on late flowers like Angelica and generally other umbellifers. In Cornwall, this bee is almost always a specialist on Angelica. And that is the weak link in the chain, because it's not really a common habitat in Cornwall, these late flowering wet hour areas with a lot of Angelica. There's actually a lot of them down Land's End in these little valleys and on the cliffs where the climate is a bit wetter. But these are a habitat that, again, quite vulnerable to being invaded by scrub. They're often neglected little patches where some form of management is needed to stop it becoming all woodland or all kind of scrub habitats. So that's the sort of threat for that bee. Going on to another bee that is, well, quite an easy bee to record that occurs in slightly different habitats. This is the green-eyed flower bee. And this is a nest site on a little strip of bare ground on the coast near St Agnes. It often likes heathy sites, but it can do okay on other kind of cliff tops and sandy ground. And this is a picture of the male. They've got these beautiful green eyes. If you get close to them and see them when they're freshly emerged, they're pretty distinctive, bright green eyes, and they fly around humming quite loudly, quite a loud buzz. And they quite like knapweed. So if you see a little tiny thing making a very high noise on a knapweed flower with green eyes, I'm sure you'll recognize this, but it is small and does require quite keen eyes to find it. So a similar related bee that's in this Anthrophora group, the four-banded flower bee, is about the same size, and it's got grey eyes. And this is a bee that is nationally scarce. I should have said the green-eyed flower bee is local or scarce. This bee is nationally scarce. And this is found in different habitats. I was really pleased one year that they just turned up in my garden in Lou on the Viper's bugloss. And there aren't that many records in the country of this bee, and it's a nice one, probably showing how both gardening and how recorders in their garden can both generate new records and find out something about some of these coastal bees that might do well in garden habitats. Not much is known about this bee, really. I mean, a lot of the books say it likes lavender in deep tubed flowers, but a couple of anecdotal accounts sort of suggest it might be very strongly associated with borage and that kind of plant. So look out in your garden if you're lucky enough to have any Viper's bugloss or cultivated echium, and you have a coastal garden, for a little grey bee with greyish green eyes flying quite quickly. Another bee you can identify is this one, the black mining bee. It's basically a small solitary bee that's black and hairy all over. Without going into too much depth, or at least trying desperately to avoid going into depth on this bee, there's a very closely related bee that probably doesn't occur in Cornwall that looks very similar. So this bee we call sense lat, which means it actually could be two species, but generally you're seeing the Pilipes. I'm going to get in a right tongue twist trying to explain this. The Cornish one, when you see that, and it's quite acceptable to call it the black mining bee, Andrena pilipes sensa lat. And if you look on wild carrot on the North Cornish coast, you'll often see a little black mining bee like this, or often in spring on plants like thrift as well. Trying desperately to get out of taxonomy and the complicated structuring of bee names. Back to red clover, and a big area of red clover, probably my favoured habitat. Here you can see the north coast, abundant sheet of flowers. This is the kind of amount of flowers these solitary ground nesting bees need near their nest. And so legumes, another very important plant group for these solitary specialised bees, often because their protein content is very high. So the pollen is highly nutritious, with a very high protein content. So some of these bigger bees really love it and really go for it. So the clover Melita leporina, you can see a shot of it on flight at Godrevy. It's fairly easy bee to see, but this is quite a difficult bee to identify. So if you see a very fast thing on clover, it's probably about honeybee size. It's actually quite small, but it might be this one with little, I mean, actually the other photo, it's got little bands along the back end of it. Many of these specialist bees, legume specialists, are quite happy with any of the legumes, but as in they probably cope with any legume, but they actually often have a bit of a preference for maybe a smaller group with it. So this bee often likes the group of clovers, so it doesn't seem to be that fussed whether they're red clover or white clover, but it likes that general group. But it probably does also use other kind of legumes families, although I would guess not bird's foot trefoil because it's got quite a different flower structure. So well, you'll often find that some of these legume specialists, they'll partition out a resource of legumes, like a nice meadow with bird's foot trefoil and clover. You'll probably find one type of bee on the clover and one type of bee on the trefoil, and if you're lucky enough to have tufted vetch or one of the other vetches, another bee on that. But that's a bit of a longer story. So the Melita, the clover bee there, has also got quite a specialised nomad, and this is the bluntthorn nomad bee. I've only ever seen it once in Cornwall. It might be more common. It's probably on a couple of these dune sites where there's big populations of this, the clover Melita. But some of these cuckoos are quite difficult to find. Really, you have to be one of these mad enough enthusiasts to sort of stand with your net right by the busy path where all the tourists are going backwards and forwards with flip-flops, and have the people with flip-flops ask you what you're doing staring at that little patch of dirt. And that's the best way to find some of these rare cuckoo bees, really. Be patient, stand there and stare, try and find a nest and find it. And then you might be lucky and see one of these cuckoo bees going in and out and trying to explore the nest. I'm probably going on already way too long, but there's a whole interesting thing about these cuckoo bees that we could spend a lot of time discussing them about. I think it's about 30 or 40% of British fauna is actually cuckoo bees. And they're a bit of a neglected thing that the general public probably wouldn't know much how important they are for a bee fauna. This is the bee I probably spent most work on, and I'm actually running my own project especially on this, which is a bit of an informal ad hoc project where I'm working with site owners, landowners, trying to boost flower resources and protect some of the sites for this bee. So this is the longhorn bee, Eucera longicornis. Laura mentioned the site in the site in Devon that hosts this species, that also hosts its specialist cuckoo. There are very old records for that cuckoo in Cornwall. And now, although Cornwall doesn't still host the cuckoo, it's probably actually got stronger populations of this bee than the Devon populations, but they're more scattered around the Cornish coast and they're more scattered in area, with Land's End the best area to see this bee. So another bee that absolutely loves kidney vetch, and it's a very distinctive bee to look for. So you can have a lovely day in about a week's time, end of May. The last week of May is probably the best time to see males of this bee. And if you're on any habitats with loads of kidney vetch, particularly down Land's End on the lizard, look out for a bee with massive long antennae like this. And I'll be really interested if any of you find any new sites for this bee. Again, just stare at a patch of flowers patiently and try and look with your eyes and listen for something bombing around up and down in the air on those plants. And then if you're lucky, if it's a bit cooler, it might land. And the other good way for searching for this is, again, staring at the cliffs, at nest sites and holes. All of that stuff can be very rewarding, at least it can to me anyway. So, so we were saying about specialism in legumes. I did quite a lot of work on this bee, again, collecting pollen off their legs and sent it off to the same lady who helped me with the other bee and tried to work out what they forage on. And I found in Cornwall, there are switching resources over a slightly longer period than other bees because it's a big bee and it lasts a bit longer. From the end, the first bees came out on kidney vetch, and then they'd peak on some of the other kind of vetches, meadow vetchling and common vetch. And then they'd go on to, I've just noticed there's a mistake, that should say common vetch, that yellow line. And then they'd go on to everlasting pea at the end of their life cycle, and also use white clover. But so they were using a range of flowers throughout that flight period. So they need a lot of flowers. So I estimated they needed 17,000 meadow vetchling plants to be available over on a daily, more or less daily basis, to provision enough offspring for a viable population. And whereas kidney vetch and white clover in the landscape aren't that rare and they're good alternative things, it's these sort of later vetches that are the particularly weak point in the chain again. So this bee also likes tufted vetch. So tufted vetch, everlasting peas, vetch, meadow vetchling, then they're not very rare plants, but to find that kind of quantity is rare. And this is why this bee is struggling. So another big bee that's fairly easy to identify. This is quite common in gardens, and we're just about a week or 2 weeks late, probably for me to say, oh, look out in your garden for it on the comfrey. This is the hairy flower-footed bee. It's a black hairy bee with a big long proboscis, often found on comfrey and borage plants. And again, shoots round and flies quite fast, but can be a lovely one to sit by and watch out for you in your garden and generate new records. So if you see a black bumblebee-like bee in your garden, it's probably this bee around nowish, although it's just coming to the end of its life cycle. So I did another study on this. I thought, seeing as it's a bit more common, it's a bit easier to do some work on it, and also because it's a bit earlier, it was a bit easier for me because a lot of the bees I'm interested in occur in June and July, which means I'm running around that time of year. And this is an aerial nester. So this is a nest site up here in the top of the barn. It was nesting in the gaps in between the blocks in the lime render. It also nests in cliff tops, in sheltered cliffs where there's clay type materials. So there was quite a big colony here. So I decided to try and work out how far it was going and what it was foraging on. So the first most easy thing to do to this was get a big wobbly scaffold with a ladder at my friend's place, climb up there with a big long net and stand perched on this wobbly scaffold while my friend shouted, "Have you seen one yet?" And I tried to swing my net without falling off the scaffold and get them into a little tube. So what I did in the end was, when I did manage to catch a few, was mark them with paint. So this was a non-toxic acrylic felt tip that doesn't harm them, and it take in a week or so it's sort of, well, two weeks or so it's sort of flaking out. It doesn't impact them. We marked them and then basically tried to recover them to work out how far they're going, because there's very few studies of how far bees are going, and this is quite important to work out where you need to put the flowers to be most effective. And what we found was that a bit later on, when I first did the marking, one of the friends of a friend emailed my friend and said, "Oh, I've seen one of your bees with a pink mark on it on my bugle." And this guy was 1.6 kilometers away from the barn. So that was a very good record. And over the last 3 years, I haven't done anything with this yet. I'm hoping to write an informal article about it. I've built up a dot map of where we found them, and they're going quite far distances. So this was the farthest. But the interesting thing about this was they were repeatedly visiting a cabbage field and a bugle patch 1.6 kilometers away. And although it's quite a big bee, and Laura mentioned previously how big bees forage longer distances than small bees, and it is known that the honeybee can forage potentially 3 kilometers, it's quite unusual to find these solitary bees foraging as long distances as this, and there's very little knowledge about how far they're going. Probably as a more broad rule of thumb, like the longhorn bee, I estimate really needs flower resources to be within 800 meters or so of their nest sites. So generally, we're looking at relatively compact areas they're using, although this bee is possibly a bit of an exception. But there's loads more scope to do on this sort of science that doesn't have to be the kind of domain of the kind of experts with tons of expensive material or access to research labs. There's lots you can do as an amateur naturalist to build up a picture of what these bees are doing to help save them. Where are we? We've already gone through all this. Hopefully I haven't taken too long. I've sort of ended up speeding up a bit and tried to do it quickly because I've probably gone on way too long. Late meadows, very important. Late diverse meadows in Cornwall support these amazing range of species. What you can do to help the project by citizen science and building up an idea what bees are doing, particularly on this scabious bee, which is kind of something we're in a position to do some quite interesting and quite high value work on. Late meadows, the reason why this project is late meadows are the hub or the the focus where we've got the richest communities, and we know what to do now, so we should be able to crack on and do it. So I'm working in partnership with this project, and I also grow quite a lot of plants in my own smaller scale with my own project, both field scabious for the large scabious bee and meadow vetchling for the longhorned bee, and with the citizen science there to tell us they need these compact areas in the right place of the right flowers. Even small interventions can make a bit of difference for some of these scarce species, creating these very dense patches of rich resources. Yeah, I think that's it really. So hopefully feel free to answer any questions, and I'm sorry if it sort of rambled around in a bit of a random angle, but hopefully
it was wonderful, Paddy. Thank you.
No, it was really interesting, Paddy. Thank you.